Thank you so much, Joyce. Right after Caroline and I got married, of course, I was pastoring. She was working with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and so in that, especially those early year or so of marriage, I did the majority of the cooking, at least for supper time, and that was for two reasons. One, I got home earlier than she did, and quite frankly, at that point, I was a better cook. I'd been doing more cooking. It's not because she wasn't capable. She hadn't, quite frankly, done a whole lot at that point. She had a bit to learn. Anyway, but she's an excellent cook, and I love you more than life itself. Anyway, there were a few dishes that I had that I'd really gotten really good at those, and enjoyed having those. But, I was looking for different things to change it up sometimes. And so I stumbled across this recipe once for this stuffed pecan chicken. And how it works is that you take sausage and breadcrumbs and some other stuff. I don't remember what all was in it, but you kind of mix that up, and then you cook that, but not completely done. You just mostly cook it. And then you take some boneless chicken breast and you slice them in the middle, and then you tuck this in there, and then you cook the chicken breast. And so you're doing that in a frying pan. And the recipe looked really good, and all the ingredients, it all sounded great, and so I thought, I think I'm going to try this. And so one night I did. But the problem was this: to be able to get the chicken done, it became a challenge because it's all stuffed with this stuff that you're trying to get it done as well. And so consequently, when you cook chicken a long time, you know what happens to it. It gets done, but it also gets tough. And so we ate it that night, but it was really tough. Well, fast forward a month or two after that, and we were going to be having some company one night. I think it was some church members were coming over, and I was going to cook that night. And Caroline suggested that I make whatever it was. And I said, I'm thinking about making that pecan chicken. And she said, oh, don't make that. She said, that was tough. No, make one of these others. You're really good at those. Why don't you make those? And I don't even know at that point if I gave her a response. I just was thinking in my mind, I'm going to make the pecan chicken. But I'm going to get it right this time. So anyway, I get all the ingredients together on the afternoon that folks are coming over, and I begin the process of preparing this. And I'm doing exactly what the recipe says. I mean, every ingredient, every step along the way, I'm doing exactly what the recipe is saying to do, because at that point, if I do that, certainly it's going to turn out wonderful. Well, the company arrives, I get this stuff finished, we get it on the plates, we sit down and eat, and the first bite I had, I thought, it tastes like I cut this off the tire in my trunk. I mean, it was just that tough, but I didn't say anything. Anyway, after it was over and the company left, I told Caroline, I said, that chicken was tough again, wasn't it? She said, yes, it was. And I told you ought to make something else because you're really good at that, but you just decided I just have to do this regardless of what I said. Spiritually, we find ourselves a lot like that in our relationship with God, don't we? Because there are repeated instances where God has, through His Word or through His Spirit, He has shown us exactly what it is that He wants us to do, or exactly what it is that He does not want us to do. And in spite of that clear direction from God, we put on our cowboy hat and our mask, and we start pretending that we're the Lone Ranger, and we start doing things without God. And though He has been so clear and so exacting in what He's revealed to us that He wants us to do or what He wants us to avoid, we decide, I'm going to do things my way. I'm going to do things my way. That's exactly what Lone Rangers do. You might not have thought of yourself in Western terminology, but if you have been acting that way, you're in keeping with what we've been talking about, studying the life of the Old Testament king, a guy named Saul, who was a Lone Ranger, who consistently we're going to continue to see how regularly he operated doing things without God. Here's the question for us today, though. Why do we do that? Why, when God says, do this, we decide, I'm not going to do that? Why, when God says, don't do this, we decide, I'm still going to do it? Why in this way do we behave like lone rangers, and in spite of the clarity of God, we decide we're going to do things our own way? We see the answer to that question in an episode in Saul's life in 1 Samuel chapter 15. If you would look with me in your Bibles there, 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. And we're going to be looking at nearly this entire chapter, but we're going to just start with the first few verses, okay? 1 Samuel chapter 15. We're told that Samuel, the prophet of God, also said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord." So he says, God made you the king, and God is telling you, do this. Verse 2, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek. Utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them. Kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Skip down to verse 7. We're told that Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. But he also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. So you see what's going on. God has been very clear and very explicit. And we see what's going on, that Saul, in spite of God's clearness, his clarity, his explicitness, decides, you know what, I'm going to do things my way. Why did he do it? The same reasons that we do. And here's the first. Because we think we know better. Why do we do this? Because we think we know better. All right, so in these opening verses of chapter 15, Samuel, the prophet, this mouthpiece of God, comes to Saul. And he says, and he prefaces all this by saying, listen, God sent me in the first place to anoint you as the king over Israel. You are in this position because God used me to anoint you, to put you into that place. But the same God who sent me to anoint you has a clear, explicit command that he wants you to obey. And that is to punish Amalek, the nation of Amalek, the Amalekites. And the Hebrew word that's used here, and the concept of what Saul and Israel's armies are being told to do, is to conduct what the Hebrew word is called a karam. A karam is complete, utter, all-out, full-throttle war where there are to be no survivors among the defeated. And so God is telling him, don't just simply go and fight Amalek, but I'm wanting you to go and fight them and utterly destroy them. There should not be a single survivor, not simply among the people, but even among the children and even among their animals. There should be nothing left of this nation. The only way in which they should continue to exist is for people to say, didn't there used to be a country called Amalek? I don't know. I don't know where any of them are. They're all gone. Well, why was God telling them to do this? Because, quite frankly, God had been very gracious and forbearing towards this pagan nation. But finally, he decides, I cannot allow their godlessness to continue. I must respond. My holiness requires that I bring judgment on them. And God's plan to bring judgment on the Amalekites was to use his people, Israel, and their king Saul. So, not only are they called to a task and to a work, but in truth, this was a solemn task because they are being used by God as the instruments of God's judgment. So hearing this, we're told that Saul and the forces of Israel, they go and they fight. They attack the Amalekites, and it is a tremendous victory. And it is an absolute, complete, total rout of the Amalekites by Israel. I think some of you saw a ball game like that last night on TV. Anyway, so there is this complete destruction of the nation of Amalek. I say complete, but not entirely complete. Why? Because we're told that Saul, first of all, in verse 8, he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. Well, why do you think Saul would have kept Agag, their king, alive? Maybe it was as a personal trophy. We don't know for sure. But beyond that, we're told in verse 9 that the people in Saul, they spared the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good. So God said, kill, destroy everything, take nothing, not a single thing alive, leave nothing alive. But Saul decides, we'll keep their king, and the best of the animals will keep those. What kind of makes sense, for at least from our perspective on the animals, because we could say, there's nothing wrong with these. I mean, this could have been food for them. It could have been used for sacrifices and offerings. It's a shame to waste all of those. But it's interesting, again, what we're told, that Saul decided he was not going to do this. They were unwilling to utterly destroy them. Everything despised and worthless, that they got rid of. So here again, you've got God being as clear as He can possibly be. Wipe them off the face of the earth. Spare, save nothing. And Saul decides, I've heard what God has said, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'll spare the king, I'll keep the best of the animals. Why did he do this? Because it seems that Saul, in his mind, thought he knew better. That maybe somehow he might be able to use Agag. He could perhaps become maybe a mentor. Perhaps he's been at this whole monarch thing a whole lot longer, and he could use him as a sounding board. Perhaps it was that he could parade him around as a trophy. These animals, maybe they could use them for all sorts of things, from food to religious sacrifices, all these things. I know what God has said, but. And so he does things his own way. Why? Because Saul, in his seemingly infinite wisdom, decides, in spite of what God has said, I'm going to do something different because I know better. We live in a brick house here in Greensboro, and though our house is brick, at some point along the way, a previous owner decided to paint the brick. I don't know why you would paint a brick house, because that's why you want a brick house. For two reasons. One, the big bad wolf can't blow it down. And two, because you don't want to have to paint it, right? So anyway, but a previous owner has painted the brick. And once you've got painted brick, you need to keep that up. Anyway, so we've got this brick house. It's painted white. The front porch is essentially just kind of a stoop. There's two steps, and the steps are trimmed in brick, and then there's just poured concrete for where the landing is. Anyway, we've lived in that house a little over 3 years, and in that time, the paint on the house is doing fine, except the paint on the brick around that step, it was really starting to look bad. It was dirty. It was peeling off. It needed to be scraped, taken down as far as we possibly could, down to the bare brick, and just repainted. So back in early December, I decided, I'm tired of looking at this, I'm going to fix this. So I went out there first, and I scraped everything that I possibly could off with a scraper and a wire brush. Once I did that, then I pressure washed it so that I'm getting the brick clean, and then seeing if I can strip any more paint off of it. At this point, I know that I need to let it dry before I can paint it. And so in that intervening waiting time, I have gone to Home Depot to see about getting some paint. I told them over in the paint section, hey, this is what I'm doing. And they recommended, hey, that we've got some masonry paint. It's made for painting brick and concrete. It's already got primer in it. You're good to go with it. But before I left, I asked this question: is it too cold to paint brick now? He said, in truth, so long as you're above freezing, you're okay. But be careful, just because the air temperature is above freezing does not mean that the brick is warm enough. Okay, so I heard all of that. Anyway, I go home and I've got this clean brick, and the next morning, it was Saturday morning, I got up and I thought, I'm going to wait until maybe after lunch, early afternoon. At that point, we'll be up in the low 40s. I'll be fine. So lunch comes, it's, 42, 43, 45 degrees outside, and I go outside, and again, the guys told me, the brick's got to be warm. I'm going to take a thermometer and hold it on there. I mean, how do I know? So anyway, I just decided I'm going to paint it. And so I did that, and it looks so much better. And the other reason I wanted to go ahead and get this painted is because they were forecasting rain Saturday night into Sunday morning. So I want to go ahead and get this done, get it taken care of. So that's what I did, and it looks so much better. And that night, somewhere around 6 or 7 o'clock, it began to trickle rain. And as the evening wore on, it began to rain even more. And Sunday morning, I get up, I come to church, and after the service is over, I go back home to eat lunch. And as I pull in the driveway, something catches my eye over on those steps. And my first thought is, a leaf must have blown with that storm, and it's maybe stuck to the paint. And so as I walk closer to it, I realize, no, that's not a leaf that I see on the brick. That's the brick, the red brick. What yesterday was white is red again. I would say that the rain washed away somewhere 90% of the paint that I put on that brick. Here's the question, why? Well, you could say it was the rain, but the rain washed it away because the brick was too cold and the paint couldn't dry. Well, why did I paint it? Is it because I wasn't told what to do? No. It's because I decided I know better. Let me just tell you, when you know better, odds are you don't. When you tell yourself, I know better, your paint's going to wash off. When you decide that you know better than God, when He has given very clear and explicit instructions, when you decide, I'm not going to do that, that is a very dangerous place to be. But unfortunately, a lot of people find themselves in that spot. Saul sure did. He got there like people do today because they think that they know better. But there's another reason. Because we think we can rationalize our behavior. In verse 10, we pick up the story. We're told that the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king. He's turned his back from following me and has not performed my commandments. God is telling Samuel, hey, this one that I told you to anoint, he is behaving like a lone ranger. He's turned his back on me, and he's been heading in the opposite direction. And there is this feeling of regret that I have that he is the king. We're told in response that this reality grieved Samuel, and he cried out all night. I don't know why it was that this so grieved Samuel. Perhaps it was that he just really personally liked Saul a whole lot and recognized Saul's in a bad spot and God's going to be dealing with him. Perhaps it was because he viewed his own part in Saul becoming king. He was personally invested and felt like what was going on with Saul reflected negatively on him. We don't know. All we know is that it was a sleepless night for Samuel. He grieved all night. The next morning, though, he's to go out and he's to meet Saul. In verse 12, we're told the word came to Samuel that Saul went to Carmel. And indeed, he set up a monument for himself, and he's gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. All right, so Samuel knows, I've got to go and speak a word from God to Saul because of what he's done. God gave a command, he disobeyed it, God's got a word for him, and I need to go find him. Well, and where he discovers that Saul is at Carmel. And he's at Carmel for a very specific reason. He is erecting a monument to himself because of the victory over the Amalekites. Now, do you see the irony of this? What is getting ready to put him in hot water is the very thing that Saul is feeling pride over. I've done such a great thing. We've experienced such a great victory. You know what? I'm going to build a monument to myself. That's one of the perks of being king. You can do that, and that's exactly what he is doing. And so verse 13, Samuel gets there, and he goes to Saul. And Saul says to him, blessed are you of the Lord. I mean, sugar wouldn't melt in Saul's mouth. This is a great day for him. He's got this victory behind him. He's got this monument that's going to stand for generations to come, reminding people of the greatness of Israel's first king. Samuel, it's so good to see you. By the way, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. You remember that, that recently you told me to go do this? You know what? I have done so. And he's patting himself on the back. Everything God said to do, check that off the list, Samuel. I did that. But then verse 14 says, 14, Samuel has a question. What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ear and the lowing of oxen I hear? Where'd those animals come from? Those sheep over there, those oxen over there making that noise, where do they come from? Look at Saul's response. He says, they have brought them from the Amalekites. Who is they? That's his people, that's his armies. The people have spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we've utterly destroyed. And then there's this exchange that takes place between Samuel and Saul. In verse 20, Saul says to Samuel, listen, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I've gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. Oh, and by the way, I have brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. I mean, do you see again what's going on? He has intentionally and willfully defied the clear commandment of God. And when he's confronted about it, the first thing that he does is to say, oh, by the way, the people did this. Oh, it just kind of happened. I've got no responsibility in this. Oh, and by the way, yeah, forgot about that. Agag, the king of the Amalekites, we spared him. But you know what? In truth, now, Samuel, I want you to understand, everything God told us to do, we have done that. The problem is he had not done that. He had explicitly not done this. Verse 21, he says, the people took of the plunder, the sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. Isn't that interesting? He does something, quite frankly, that a lot of people do today. They say or they do something, but they put a spiritual cloak on the end of the sentence or somehow guise their behavior in spiritual terminology, and they feel like that makes it okay. So Samuel, confronting Saul says, the people did this. Oh, we did happen to spare Agag. Oh, but by the way, we did everything that God said. Oh, and those animals over there, we kept those, for sacrifices, to give those to God. Yet we want to give to God the very thing that He said to destroy. And oh yeah, by the way, we did exactly what God told us to. Why did Saul do this? Not only did he in his mind think, I know better. I should do things my way because I've got a better perspective in mind. But he also does so because in his mind, he thinks there's a great rationale. There's a great way to explain all of this. And if I've got a good explanation, that makes everything better. That somehow makes it okay. It doesn't make any difference what the rules are. So long as I've got a good explanation, that's going to suffice. I had an experience with that mentality just yesterday, in fact. I am scheduled tomorrow to leave on a flight from Greensboro. It's going to connect in Charlotte and go to Nashville. There's this pastor's workshop thing that I'm going to at Lifeway in Nashville Monday through Wednesday of this week. Anyway, our power went out on Friday, and it's still out. And we have family in Charlotte, Caroline's parents' house. It really accommodates our family really well. And so since Friday night, we have gone to Charlotte. And so that's been nice, especially with young kids. We're not sitting in a freezing cold, dark house. Anyway, the prospect of power coming on imminently in our neighborhood doesn't look very good. We've yet to see the first Duke Power truck, the first tree crew, the first anything. And it's just pitch black around there. And so yesterday afternoon, though, I came to Greensboro. I wanted to make sure everything was taken care of, ready for us to go here at church. I was going to stop by the house, pick up some more clothes, head back to Charlotte so that we could spend the night, and then Caroline and I were going to come up this morning, and that's what we did. Anyway, what my thought was this. All right, I'm supposed to leave Greensboro on a flight at 7:38 on Monday morning from Greensboro. Well, that plane goes to Charlotte, and everybody on that plane gets off and gets on another airplane that goes to Nashville. Well, if my family's in Charlotte, why don't I just go and stay Sunday night in Charlotte, and Caroline can take me to the airport at Charlotte Douglas. I'll get on that plane with everybody else that just came here from Greensboro. Isn't that reasonable? Sure it is. So I was coming back yesterday, and I called U.S. Air as I was driving, and I explained to them, listen, we've had this ice storm in Greensboro. My family is in Charlotte. I'd like to be there as well. This flight leaves so early. Is it possible that I can just show up at Charlotte Douglas, get on the plane, and then head to Nashville from there? They said, yes, you can do that. However, by changing the itinerary, it's going to cost $200. In addition to that, you have to pay the fare difference, which is an additional $238. And I said, but nothing's changing. A plane leaves Greensboro, it goes to Charlotte, and all those people get on a different airplane. I just don't want to be on the first one. Can I just be on the second one? Well, yes, for $438 additional dollars. Okay, well, thank you. So then I had a bright idea. I got off the phone with them. I thought, you know what I need? I need a supervisor. And so I called the number back, and very graciously, calmly, I asked, I said, yeah, I've got some circumstances here. I wondered if there's a supervisor that's available. And they said, yes. So the supervisor comes on the phone, and very calmly, coolly, collectively, I'm explaining this. I said, we've got this ice storm. She said, yeah, our call center is over here in Winston. I know all about what's going on over there. And finally, what she said was this, you know what, as a courtesy, what I'll do is waive the $200 fare or itinerary change, but you'll still be responsible for the difference of $238, because at that point, it's not a flight from Greensboro to Nashville, it's a flight from Charlotte to Nashville. I wanted to say this. Don't you hear good? Nothing is changing. I don't want to pay this. And she asked, do you want to make that change? And I said, for $238, no, I'm sorry, I don't. And I said, it just stinks. It just stinks. I hate this. And I concluded with these words, you know what? I don't get to write the rules. I just have to follow them. I don't get to write the rules. I just have to follow them. Listen, there's going to be things that God is going to communicate to you, whether through His Word or through His Spirit, that in your mind, it doesn't make any sense. And doing things your way it makes all the sense in the world. It is not simply a different way, it's an altogether better way, because in your mind, it makes such perfect sense, and you've got a great rationale and a great explanation for it, and so you decide, hey, I'm going to do things my way, but I want you to understand this. It is not your prerogative to write the rules. It is only your prerogative to obey the rules. But Saul didn't operate that way. He was a lone ranger, and he thought, I want to do things my way because I know better, and because I know better, I also know I can explain this away. Listen, God's not looking for your explanation. He's looking for your obedience. Notice what Samuel's response in verse 22 to all this is. He said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? He said, I don't care how much money you're putting in the offering plate. I don't care how many calves you put on the altar. I don't care how many turtle doves that you sacrifice. I don't care how many times you go to the temple. I don't care how many times it is that you bow your head in prayer. All that means nothing to God so long as you're disobeying what He said. God would far rather you obey Him than to give Him all of that stuff. God would far rather you just do what He says than to supply Him all of this empty ritual. To obey is better than to sacrifice, but Saul did not get that. He was going to do things his own way. He thought he knew better. He thought he could rationalize his behavior, but there was a final reason that he and so many of us do things our way. And that's because we think that little things won't cost in big ways. Because we think that little things will not cost in big ways. After telling Saul that God desires obedience more than sacrifice, in verse 23, Samuel begins to paint the picture for Saul of exactly what's going on. He calls Saul's behavior in verse 23 what? He calls it rebellion. When you decide, whether you're Saul or whether you're Michael or whoever you are, when you decide that God has said to do this, and you decide, I'm going to do that, that's rebellion. And what does God say about rebellion? It is as the sin of witchcraft or divination. Now, you tell yourself it's not that big of a deal. But rebellion is just as sinful as that of witchcraft. That stubbornness is as much sin or iniquity as idolatry. That you digging your heels in and God says go and you say no. When God says stop and you say yes. When you decide you're going to do things your own way, God says this is the moral, spiritual equivalent of idolatry. I mean, that is just as much sin as for you to do the unthinkable, to take the gold and the silver in your house and to melt that down and to make a little idol and bow down and worship that and call that God. That's consequential, what he's saying, isn't it? I mean, it belies an understanding that I believe most of us are operating with, which is this. When push comes to shove, sin is sin, period. Now, we recognize, and the Bible paints the picture, that some sins are greater in terms of consequence. I mean, some sins will affect you or affect others in more consequential ways. But when you break it down, there's only two categories. There's sin and not sin. And anything that's disobedience to God, it's all going to go in the sin category. In Saul's mind, he thought, you know what, I'm just sparing a king. You know, this is a king that I can parade around as a trophy and say, look at what we did. There's their king. Look at him. He's handcuffed and he's duct taped over his mouth. Look at him. We're going to taser him every once in a while just to watch him dance. This would be a great trophy so we can intimidate other nations. We'll hold on to him. And these other animals, you know, we should just hold on to those. We can use them for sacrifice. We can use them for a barbecue. We can use them for all kinds of stuff. There's no need to get rid of all of them. We'll just hang on to these. Yeah, I know God said this. I know he said to get rid of them. But, you know, honestly, if we kill 99,999 out of 1,000, isn't that close enough? If we take only the best sheep and the best oxen and the best goats and the best of the animals, you know, it's just not that big of a deal, is it? He thought he knew better. He thought, yeah, I can explain this away. And then he thought, you know, it's just not that big of a deal, and so there won't be a whole lot of consequence. But what was the consequence? You see it in verse 23, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Plain and simple. God is the one that made you the king. And God is the one that has decided you're no longer going to be king. Why? Because he did not do what God said. God said, do this. Saul decided, I'm not going to. And God said, fine. But here's the consequence. God is not going to force his ways on you. He's not going to beat you over the head. He's not going to kick you in the rear end. He's not going to trip you if you start going down the wrong direction. He is not going to force himself on you. You're free. You've got the ability and the freedom, the wherewithal to obey him or to disobey him. But here's the deal. Though you are free to choose what you do, you are not free to choose the consequences for your actions. Saul decided, I'm going to do things my way, and it cost him. And it cost him big. It seemed to be such a little deal. Little things have little consequences. Big things have big consequences. But Samuel's saying, listen, it's all sin. God told you what to do, and that's in the same category as idolatry. It's the same category as witchcraft. And because of that, you're no longer going to be the king. This belies a very simple principle that you see throughout both Old and New Testaments. Very simply stated, it's this: God takes sin seriously. How much of it? All of it. It's all a consequential matter to Him. It's all something that deserves a response from Him. It's all that which will get a response from Him. And if you're telling yourself, oh, I know that God said this, but, and thinking it's going to be okay, I'm telling you, it's not going to be completely okay. Because even little acts of disobedience absolutely can cost in big ways. Years ago, there was a young teenager who was working as a clerk in a hardware store. And hardware stores at this day, of that day, were similar to those of today. And that is that there were a lot of items that were around that they had on the shelf just in case. Somebody may need this. We'll have that in stock so that just in case they show up, it'll be here and they can buy it from us. But because of that, there was a lot of inventory that were just sitting there gathering dust because just in case never happened. And so this young teenager was aware. He didn't have to have a PhD in economics to recognize if we keep all of this inventory, we're spending money to buy it and we're not making anything on it. So he suggests to his boss, the owner of the hardware store, listen, why don't we put some tables up here in the middle of the store, and this stuff that has been sitting up here gathering dust for years, why don't we put it on this table and we'll put everything on this table for a dime. Now at this point, obviously to us, a dime seems, that's chump change. You don't even have to pick the dime up off the ground. At this point in history and the life of our country, 10 cents was fairly consequential. But let's put everything on that table for a dime. And so the boss, somewhat reluctant, decided, we'll try this out. And the young boy's idea, it was a colossal success. And everything they put on there, they sold. And they actually got money. Instead of it just sitting up there gathering dust, they had money in their pockets for these products. It went so well that the young clerk suggested, hey, how about we do this again? So they did it again, and again made more money. And the boss was thrilled about this. And so after having witnessed this twice, this young teenager says to the owner of this hardware store, he said, listen, in addition to having a hardware store, here's a business proposal for you. Why don't we start another store? And everything in the store will sell for either 5 cents or 10 cents. And hearing this, the owner of the hardware store said, that's a terrible idea because you'll never be able to find enough stuff to fill a store that you can sell for 5 cents or 10 cents. The plan will never work. Well, hearing that, the young teenager was disappointed, but his dream did not die. And finally, he got enough money together to open his first store. Well, you might not have gone to school with him or anything, but so many of you are familiar with that young man's name. It was F.W. Woolworth. And years later, the former owner of the hardware store said this, as near as I can figure it, every word I used in turning Woolworth down has cost me about $1 million. Every word I used to tell him no has cost me $1 million. Listen, little things can cost in big ways. A little thing for Saul cost him the kingdom, cost him God's blessing, cost him God's hand on his life and on his reign. Listen, if it happened to Saul, why would it not happen to you? Do not kid yourself. This Lone Ranger living, it makes for great TV shows, it makes for entertaining movies, but it makes for lousy Christian living. Doing things apart from God is a dangerous place to be and a dangerous path to go. But it's an easy one to go because we can, like Saul, tell ourselves, I know better. I can explain my behavior away. I've got a good explanation for it. And even though God said this, I can disobey. I can just kind of do what He said, and it won't cost me. It cost Saul big time. My simple question for you this morning is this. What might even your smallest acts of disobedience to God be costing you? You can't undo the cost or the consequence of the past, but you can affect what's going on now. You can affect what's going on tomorrow. The question is, what will you do? Won't you bow your heads with